So now on to Kantian ethics. Kantian ethics is heavily rooted in moral duty, principles, and rationality. They follow universal laws and moral obligations. Kant emphasizes goodwill in his theory, essentially a will that acts purely out of duty and respect for the universal moral law. Although consequences can be unpredictable and kind of morally gray in a lot of circumstances, the goodwill ensures that actions are morally worthy simply because they are done out of a sense of duty. An important characteristic of Kant's theory is maxims. Maxims are the principles that are established prior to an action. For example, when I am in circumstances C, I am to do X. Excuse me. To Kant, actions are those that follow maxims and that can be universally applied without contradiction. Other important characteristics of his theory is the categorical imperatives and the hypothetical imperatives. So similar to maxims, they kind of have like an equation that you can follow. Categorical imperatives are the unconditional moral obligations that we all have that are binding in all circumstances. For example, do X or don't do Y. Also, categorical imperatives have two formulations. The first being act only in accordance with that maxim that you can will without contradiction to become a universal law of nature. Essentially, an action is moral only if it can be consistently willed as a universal law. The second formulation is always act in such a way as to treat people, oneself, and others as an end in themselves and never as a mere means. This formulation prohibits using others solely as tools for personal gain. While on the other hand, hypothetical imperatives are kind of the blueprint for the use of reason in the interest of achieving a goal. For example, if you want X, do Y. However, I do see plenty of issues with Kant's theory. I think that because of how strict and rigid his theory is, there's very little room for the more complex situations that life throws at you. Kant makes a point to ignore consequences altogether and simply act on what is universally moral, which I think that having that kind of structural and having the like universal laws is a good quality, but again, I feel like real life situations deserve a little more, I guess, complexity, or they have a little bit more complexity. I think that it's kind of not realistic to just ignore consequences altogether. I know that personally, I am always thinking of like the consequences of my actions and if I say this wrong, if I do this wrong, etc. And like, I just don't think it's like realistic for everyone to ignore consequences altogether as, you know, he would like. And I feel like ignoring those consequences also means like we're ignoring the relationships and social context of situations. And again, I'm going to use the murderer at the door scenario. You know, if there was a murderer at the door and my friend is upstairs, according to Kant, I would have to tell the murderer where my friend is. I could, or if I was asked, I would have to tell the truth and say that they were upstairs. However, I cannot picture myself doing that. And I know that when he, in his explanation, he explained that lying is just universally and morally wrong no matter what. However, I just feel like the situation, and not just the situation, any situation is a lot more complicated than that, and that I would certainly not tell the truth. But I also don't think that because I wouldn't tell the truth in that scenario that I am a morally bad person or I'm an immoral person. Which is also why I feel like the intense structure and rigidity of the theory is harmful to it. Another issue I find with it is the way it evaluates a person's morality, like I just somewhat touched on. I think that the maxims are, or sorry, I think that when it comes to the maxims, there are universal laws. I feel like if they are left too broad or even left too specific, it could allow like immoral behavior to happen because, for example, like if a maxim, one of his maxims is to never lie. But I don't know, if we were to never lie, I think it could cause other issues. Like if my friend asked me, "Oh, do you like these pants?" A lot of the time, I'm being honest, if I don't like it, I'm just going to lie and say yes. But then I would be a morally immoral person. If I were to tell the truth, then that would start a fight and, all this stuff. That's why I just feel like it gets, in the real world, it gets too kind of messy. But I will say I do appreciate the structure of it. I think that Kant's theory and Aristotle's virtue ethics, they are like very, very different, but I do find similar issues with them, if that makes sense. But yeah. Aristotle's virtue ethics is a theory that prioritizes character and virtue above all. According to Aristotle, virtue is achieved through habitual practices of moral characteristics. The kind of end-all be-all of his virtue ethics theory is to reach eudaimonia, otherwise known as the good life. However, the only way someone can reach eudaimonia is by possessing both arete, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I tried looking it up, but I'm still not sure. But both arete and phronesis. Arete is the character of a moral person, and phronesis is the knowledge or practical wisdom that allows the moral person to act accordingly. Phronesis is not innate, but instead learned through experiences. According to Aristotle, right actions are those that a virtuous person would choose under similar circumstances. So ethical decision-making relies on phronesis, the practical wisdom, that allows that person to navigate different moral dilemmas by considering context, emotions, and social relationships. Unlike Kantian ethics, his approach avoids rigid moral rules and instead emphasizes the importance of experience and good judgment in decision-making. According to him, morality is also not innate, but instead learned and something that takes a lot of time and effort, which is why he believed that slaves and working class people could not be virtuous or achieve eudaimonia. This is where a lot of the issues I have with the theory lie. He believed that they could not achieve it because they do not have enough time to reflect. To Aristotle, leisure time is necessary to being a moral person, which I understand, but I disagree with parts of it. To exclude slaves and working people overall because they simply do not have leisure time to do so, it's just extremely problematic and, to me personally, unfair. I understand that his theory requires a lot of practice and reflection, which may not be feasible for everyone, especially those without access to leisure time and access to moral exemplars. But I don't think that excluding a whole group of people is necessarily right for his theory. I think that working class people are very capable of practicing the same way somebody with leisure time is, and that through the habitual practice, anybody can become a moral person. The expectation to make moral decisions every single time is also too idealistic for me. I feel like oftentimes, in real life situations, they're a lot more complex than just making the right decision or the right judgment or the morally right, answer. Which is why I feel like the lack of rigidity I believe, and like rules, like and like and guidelines, makes the theory kind of difficult to follow. I think that Aristotle's virtue ethics relies on character judgment and a person's practical wisdom, which can make it difficult to resolve moral dilemmas. For example, I chose to apply the murderer at the door scenario to this theory as well, as Kant's. I feel like it's a similar thing. Like, is it the moral thing to do, or is the moral thing to do to protect your friend and lie to the murderer at the door, or is the moral thing to do to tell the truth? Unlike Kant's, which is very specific, and he even said that you have to tell the truth. This one seems this theory is obviously more open-ended and focuses more on the character. But I feel like, I don't know, I feel like the lack of structure can make the theory kind of unreliable when it comes to like complex situations like that.